Hi, my name's Dave Langer. I will be your instructor. Welcome to part 2 of Introduction to SQL for Excel Users, Basic Tables. This YouTube tutorial series is a transcription of a blog series on my website, daveondata.com, which takes your skills with Excel and teaches you how to write SQL queries. And what you'll find throughout this YouTube tutorial is that your Excel skills are awesome for allowing you to learn how to write SQL queries and pull data from relational databases. Let's get started. Okay, so here we are on my YouTube channel, the Dave on Data YouTube channel. And obviously you know where that is because you're watching this video. A couple things I wanted to mention at the very start here. One is you have two options for doing the tutorial series. You can either install all of the software that you need on your local computer, your laptop or your desktop machine. That uses what's known as Microsoft SQL Server Developer Edition. It's completely free. And if you watch this video right here, look at that handsome gentleman. If you watch this video right here, it'll go through the complete process of downloading and installing Microsoft SQL Server and SQL Server Management Studio, SSMS, the two pieces of software that you will need to do this tutorial series. They're both free. This assumes a Windows machine. Okay, so if you're using Mac, for example, this option is not going to work for you. That's where this video comes in. That's the second thing I want to mention, is that you can use Microsoft's cloud, which is known as Microsoft Azure, to also do this tutorial series on SQL. And what this video shows you is how to get set up with a free account on Azure, how to create a VM, how to use what's known as the Microsoft Data Science VM, which is like a virtual computer. It has all the software that you need already installed. Both of these videos also show you how to download the sample database that we'll be using, the AdventureWorks Data Warehouse database, and get started. Now, this is also free with a certain caveat, and that caveat is it is the cloud, so you're renting hardware, you're renting software from Microsoft. Now, they do offer a really nice free plan, and as long as you follow the instructions in this video, for example, making sure you shut your VM down when you're done with it each day, you don't use too big of a VM, all these sorts of things which I talk about in this video, you can do the blog series for free in Microsoft's cloud. And even if you take a little bit longer than you need, or you use a little bit more resources, the way I have you set things up, it's very inexpensive, even if you decide to like play around with it a little bit more. I'm talking maybe, $20 a month kind of thing. So there you have it, two options for getting started. This one is for folks with Windows machines that want to do the work locally on their desktop or laptop. And this is for anybody, including Mac users, who would like to use the cloud instead. Okay, so all of the files for this tutorial series. Now, originally I wrote this series as a collection of blog posts on my website, daveondata.com. I have now expanded it to also include these YouTube videos. All the files that you need are going to be available here on GitHub. So github.com, daveondata, SQL for Excel users. And there will also be a link in the description of each one of the YouTube tutorial videos. And you can see here, there's a whole bunch of Excel sheets, SQL for Excel users. Now, I will also be adding for the YouTube series the SQL files themselves. On my blog series, the SQL is just like a text box, so it's easy to cut and paste. So there was no point in putting SQL files in this GitHub. But for the YouTube series, I will be doing that. I will be adding SQL files as I record new YouTube tutorials in this series on SQL. And you can also grab whatever Excel files that you need from this GitHub. So remember, github.com/daveondata/SQL for Excel users. And again, I will have the link in the description of the video. Okay, so you'll notice I'm in Excel here, and I've loaded up the SQL for Excel users part 2 file, Excel workbook here. And what you see here is a table. Now, I will caution you, and for some of you, you'll think, Dave, wow, you're going through this really, really slow. And the answer is, yeah, in some cases, I'll be going through things really, really slow, and they might be super obvious to a lot of you. The reason why I'm doing that is I'm intending this tutorial series to be accessible by a broad audience, right? Someone who's only has maybe relatively fundamental, basic knowledge of Excel, but is interested in up-leveling their skills with some SQL. I wanted that type of person to find this tutorial useful. So that means I'm going to go through some things, maybe in excruciating detail. So my apologies in advance for that. Okay, so here we have a call center tab or call center worksheet inside of our workbook. And this represents tabular data. And you can see here we got some tabular data. And this essentially is data that we pulled from the AdventureWorks DW sample database that we'll be using for this series from the call center table. And this is something you commonly see in Excel, right? You've got a bunch of worksheets and there's tables on the worksheets and maybe you got some pivot tables and VLOOKUPs and all kinds of cool stuff. But for today, for this video, what I want to focus on primarily is the concept of a table and some of the things that may not necessarily be super intuitive to you as an Excel user, but are actually there behind the scenes and map conceptually to the world of SQL. So for example, this is a table. Duh, Dave, thank you. Okay, so let's go up to table design. Okay, now in the workbooks that I see an awful lot in my life as a professional, and I've been in the biz for a long time, more than 20 years, you see a lot of times people don't actually name tables, but this is exceedingly important. Every table in an Excel workbook, whether you know it or not, whether it's implicit or not, has a table name. This table's name is call center. And this is extremely important. This idea of saying, look, a table is a thing inside of Excel. It has a name. It has a bunch of columns. You see here we've got A through N. We've got a bunch of columns. It has rows of data, right? It's a table. It's a two-dimensional array, a matrix, a table. And this is important because these are things. So they have names. And the reason why they have names is because you can do cool things. Like for example, let's see here, I'm just going to pop open a new worksheet here, and I'm just going to calculate the average. And Excel says, well, okay, what do you want to calculate the average of? And I can go back over here and I can say, hey, look, I want to calculate the average of total operators here. Right? And notice what it does. Notice that now the formula up here is the average, and it's pulling from the call center table, and specifically it's calling from the total operators column. Now I can just like cap this off with a parenthesis and hit enter, and look at that. Right? Now many of you are like, whoa, wow, Dave, thanks. That's super profound. But here's the thing, for some folks, this actually is kind of profound because like I said, I have seen thousands and thousands of workbooks in my career. And a lot of times folks aren't really doing this. They don't really realize that tables have names. So they'll just use the default name that Excel will implicitly give your tabular data. And it's a name, there's a naming convention that Excel uses automatically. But this is super important because in the world of SQL, tables are extremely important. They're the fundamental thing, just like they are in Excel. And they have names, and they have columns, and they have rows. They have characteristics, okay? So this is super important. Now, another thing that's super important in Excel, which some of you might resonate with, is this idea that data inside of Excel has a format. And if you've ever worked with a workbook that has wacky formatting in the data, it's a pain. It's like, it totally sucks. So this is something that you often see folks not necessarily cognizant of when they're working with Excel, is that behind the scenes, Excel will assign a format. It will assume what kind of data is in a cell. So for example, it's going to assume that these are numbers, right? It's going to assume that these are numbers. Okay, let's go ahead and get rid of that. Back over here. So it's going to assume like this data is a number, and this data is a number, and this is a date. And this is just some sort of string value, and this is a string value, and this is like some sort of numeric value. Behind the scenes, Excel looks at those data in your tables, looks at the data in your worksheets, and it kind of assumes what it is. And if you're familiar with it, you can just like right-click on a cell, go down here to format cells, and what you see These categories are essentially types of data that Excel understands. Number data, currency data, percentages, text, special, custom. These are all types of data. And when Excel recognizes data as a certain type, or you tell it explicitly that the data in this cell is of a particular kind of type, it affects how Excel operates. Now, this is extremely important because SQL does the same thing. And we'll see SQL a little bit more later in the video, but generally speaking, it's exactly the same conceptually, right? Tables in Excel have data that have types, what Excel refers to as categories, and SQL does the same thing. SQL has tables, and the tables are made up of columns of data, and those data also have types. This is extremely important. Now, a function that most folks don't know about or use often in Excel is known as the type function. Right? You can actually ask Excel, what's the type function, or what is the type of data in this cell? So let's go ahead and just pop this open, and you can always Google type Excel. And you can see here's Microsoft's official support page for the type function. You click on that, and Nick tells you about type. So it returns back a number, a text, a logical value, error value, array. Right? So there's all kinds of things that come back from the type function, which just tells you that type matters. The formatting of the data that Excel assumes, or you tell it explicitly exists in your data, in your table, in your worksheet, is extremely important because it's going to handle things differently. And you can see here, what I've done is I've just called the type function here on the various columns here, A through D, or excuse me, A through N, excuse me, see that, all the different types. And you notice primarily they're all type 1s for the most part. And then you got weight shift and shift are type 2. So let's go back over to that Microsoft page. And we can see here, type 1 is a number and type 2 is text. Now this is super interesting because if you think about it, this is actually a date. It's obviously a date. In fact, Excel recognizes it as a date and even formats it as such, but notice it comes back as a number. And that's because behind the scenes, every date is actually a number. It's like essentially it's an offset from like some reference date point. Let's say like, and I don't remember what it is exactly in Excel, so I'm going to make this up, but you'll get the idea. So maybe it's midnight, January 1st, 1900. And then the number, quote unquote, that makes up the date is the number of seconds since that date. So this might actually be a number of like 123,337 seconds since January 1st at midnight, 1900, for example. That's typically how these things work. Now, this is really super important. Even if you're not really familiar with formatting and typing, conceptually what you need to know is Excel's doing it behind the scenes, whether you realize it or not. And what makes it really super important is because in a SQL, it's in your face, as we'll see in a second. Data typing is super, super important and is a fundamental idea in SQL tables. Okay, so that's enough for Excel. Let's go ahead and move over to SQL and see how these things that we just talked about conceptually map. All right, here we are in Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. You can see here, SSMS. And we've connected to our local machine. Or if you were in the Azure cloud, you'd be on the VM, and the SSMS software would be running on the VM, connecting to the database server on the VM. Now, if we expand this, we can see a whole bunch of stuff. We're not going to be using any of these things really in this video series. There's a whole bunch of stuff in SQL Server. It's an enterprise class database. It is last time I checked, it is the third most commonly used database in the world behind something called PostgreSQL and MySQL. So it's a very commonly used database. It's used in companies very large and very small. It has all kinds of features. But for us, we're just going to be worrying about this folder right here, the databases folder. So if I open this up, I can see some things that we're not going to care about. Do not mess with the system's databases, people, okay? And do not worry about database snapshots. The only thing that we care about is this thing right here. This is the sample database that you downloaded and installed either on your local machine or in your Azure VM, and it's the AdventureWorks data warehouse, the sample database from Microsoft. So if we open that up, once again, a whole bunch more stuff. Now, I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, and I apologize, but most of the things that we care about when we first get started with SQL, especially from a data analysis perspective, is very concentrated in a very small part of SQL Server. Mainly what we tend to care about are two things, tables and views. We'll get to views much later in the series. Right now, and for a long time to come, we're just going to be working with the tables because that's where all the data is stored. So if we open up the tables, we can see that there's a few tables here in the data warehouse. And the one that we're interested in is the table that we call Fact Call Center. Now you'll notice that in the Excel workbook, it was just called Call Center. And here's called Fact Call Center. That's because these naming conventions, fact, and notice here dims and facts, that is a data warehousing kind of naming convention. And for our purposes, we don't really care for this series about that. If you're interested in data warehousing, I recommend the books authored by Ralph Kimball. A Kimball-style data warehouse is a beautiful thing for an analytics professional, but that's way beyond the scope of this YouTube tutorial series. Okay, so here we go. As I said earlier, not only are tables the fundamental construct in Excel, they are the fundamental construct in SQL, in a relational database, in a database. Tables are the thing. There, it's the jam, man. And here we have Fact Call Center. So as I said earlier, Fact Call Center has a name. You have to be able to distinguish this table from fact currency rate, from fact finance, and so on and so forth. So tables have names in the database, just like they do in Excel. Now, if I click this plus and open it up, once again, there's a bunch of things we don't care about. Typically, the thing that we worry about in our early days working with SQL are the columns, just like we tend to worry about the columns in an Excel table. So if I open up this folder, you can see here a whole bunch of things. These are all of the individual columns. Now, if I flip over to Excel real quick here, and I'll shrink this up a little bit so you can see them kind of side by side. You can see here, Fact Call Center ID, Fact Call Center ID. Date key, wage type, so on and so forth, right? So all of the columns that are listed here are also listed in this table. Now, if I scroll over here, if you remember, we only had basically two types as far as Excel was concerned behind the scenes in our table. We had a whole bunch of numeric data denoted by ones, and then we had some text data denoted by twos. But if you notice over here, things get a lot more complicated. And we don't need Excel anymore, so I'll just go ahead and minimize that. Things get a lot more complicated. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this right now. I just want you to get the base concept that data format, data type in Excel matters. And it matters a ton in SQL. Because what will happen in Excel is that Excel tries to be smart. It tries to help you out. It tries to automatically detect what type of data, what format of data you have in your worksheet or in your table, and operate on it in ways that you would expect as an Excel user. It's smart. It tries to be helpful. Now, if you've ever worked with a really complicated Excel spreadsheet that was formatted incorrectly, you realize that sometimes Excel's quote-unquote help is actually a bad thing. But generally speaking, for most people, Excel just handles the data formatting and automatically just does things, and it automatically works, and life is great. In SQL, it takes a different approach. It says, look, you have to explicitly tell me what the data format, what the data type is, and I will then use well-defined rules to work with that data. And also, by the way, you as the SQL coder, you also need to adhere to those rules. Now, it makes certain things, as we'll see later in the series, a little bit more painful, a little bit more work than in Excel, but in the end, it's actually quite powerful. And this is very common in programming languages. They tend to have explicit typing. They tend to have explicit formatting, and they tend to have explicit rules on how you work with data of different formats, data of different types. So if you ever decide to go on, for example, and learn a programming language like Python, or my favorite, R, these are how these programming languages work behind the scenes. So SQL is actually really good for teaching folks that are interested on moving up the advanced analytics tool chain, if you will, in terms of understanding how these things work. SQL is a very good starter language for lots of folks because of that. Okay, so what you'll see here is fact call center ID here, for example. Ignore the PK and ignore the not null for a second. This thing right here is what I'm interested in, where it's an int, and that stands for integer. And an integer is a whole number without a decimal point. It's a numeric type, but it doesn't have a decimal. It doesn't have a fractional part. So this is a number, this is a number. This right here, where it says in varchar, that tells you that it's text data. And we'll go into more detail later on in this series. I just want to point out these different data types and how they're explicit, right? Because here we have an int, and here we have a small int, which intuitively tells you that the size of the number is probably smaller here than it is here, because what's the difference between an int and a small int? Well, probably the size of the number, and so on and so forth. So this is an extremely important idea, is that you have data types and you need to pay attention to them. Now, we can take a look at the data real quick by just right-clicking with your mouse on Fact Call Center and just select the top 1,000 rows. Now, this table doesn't have 1,000 rows of data in it, which is a-okay. It has 120 rows in it. You can see that down here, 120 rows. But you'll notice that the results here look basically just like they do in Excel. Right? The results of running this query to say, hey, SQL Server, give me the top 1,000 rows from the Fact Call Center table. And it says, okay, here you go, Dave. Here's the top 1,000 rows. It only happens to be 120, but here they are. And the output, the results here, are exactly the same as what we saw in Excel. So here you go, right? We have 120 rows of data. We have X number of columns in Excel, in our table, call center table, and same thing here we have in SQL. They're exactly the same thing. Now, this right here is a SQL query. This is a SQL query. We'll go into more detail, of course, in this throughout the series, but this is what it kind of looks like. Just what you type in and you run it against the database, and essentially it says, look, hey, database, I want to go to this particular table. Ignore all this jazz here. Just focus on this right here. Go to Fact Call Center. Right? I want to pull data from Fact Call Center. And I want you to select the top 1,000 rows, and I want all of these columns. Okay. In the next video, we're going to talk a lot more about selects, but this is just a preview of coming attractions. So that's it for this video. I'm going to try and keep the videos between 20 and 30 minutes or so. And if you like this type of content, feel free to head over to my website, daveondata.com. I have lots of blog posts and other types of resources available for folks that are interested in expanding their analytics skill sets. Until next time, I wish you happy data sleuthing.